Hi, friends. Welcome to episode 3 of Dr. Russell's Quarantine Book Club with the number one ladies detective agency. Um, that was unnecessarily perky, but whatever. I liked it. I have my mug here, different mug today. And we're going to take a break from kind of talking about detective fiction and cases to talk a little bit about difference and to give some history um, of the sort of diversity that emerges from a history of colonization, right? So, in chapter 7, Matamotsue, she consults with Mr. JLB Matakoni, who is her love interest, but we'll get to that in a different video, about this missing boy. So, we have now encountered this scene where this young boy, late at night, gets kidnapped by these two strangers. We don't know who these strangers are. They take him in their truck. They drive him somewhere. We know that he's been kidnapped, but we don't know by whom or for what. She gets a letter from his father, just kind of asking, like, can you just keep your ear to the ground about this thing and see if you can find my son? So she goes over to consult with her longtime friend, and he suggests that perhaps the boy has been taken by witch doctors, right? With the interest of sort of sacrificing him. And he's like, this is a thing we don't talk about, but we're all scared of it. We know it exists. Um, it's just a reality that we don't want to accept. And so I want to kind of broach this subject a bit in this video. So what he's talking about, and our word for this video is westernization. And westernization is what happens when, so whether someone's been kind of a country, meaning not someone, a country has been, well, I guess an individual could be westernized. Anywho, when a place has been colonized or otherwise kind of influenced by this global economy. So we have this concept called the West. And what we mean by that are kind of countries, mostly European countries, right? And the US and that specific kind of culture. And we're also talking about capitalism. So that is the quote unquote Western world, which isn't a very scientific concept, but it is more of a cultural thing, right? That's the West. And the East, we refer to as kind of Asia often. So, of course, we're talking about, right, the white world versus people of color in the world. And just for the record, there are more people of color in the world, right, than there are people who we would call white people. Um, and so what happens, right, is that in a lot of places, right, indigenous culture gets, so the culture that is sort of native to that place, gets kind of replaced with quote unquote Western culture. And then it becomes, well, indigenous culture is old, it is a thing of the past, it's not modern. So here we go with the traditional versus modern idea. And so that becomes a part of that tension. Um, and so in this case, right, if we're talking about spirituality, you have, right, a strong Christian presence in Botswana in this text, which we've already seen, right, with the previous case with the man getting eaten by the alligator while he's getting baptized, poor guy. But at some point, right, this area of the world was not Christian, right, and they practiced indigenous spirituality. It's called voodoo in some places, it's called hoodoo in other places. We use words like witch doctors. But I want us to be very careful about passing judgment on those things, right? Passing judgment on sort of indigenous spiritual practices, including witch doctors, who are people who practice natural medicine, right? In the real world, who use herbs and other kinds of concoctions instead of medicine, pills, etc. Right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, with being not Christian, with practicing sort of indigenous cultural or spiritual practices or what have you. But, you know, the sacrifices of people or, you know, the use of blood, those kinds of things, like, are also a part of this history. And that's what's being referred to here. There's this idea of like that was a part of our past. It is, and we don't do that anymore. And so it becomes this kind of unspoken thing of like, yeah. There are some people who have not grown into this modern, i.e., Western way of being, and who still practice that, and like they kidnap our kids. Um, and so I think that's a very complicated idea, right? So again, all people who practice indigenous spiritual practices are not bad. Um, all people who do, you know, rituals and who create herbal medicines instead of using modern medicine are not bad. And keeping those traditions alive is important. The other thing is, for a number of cultures, lots and lots of cultures, indigenous cultures in particular, they don't have the same kind of division between good and evil as we do, right? We apply these value statements to them, right? Good is good and evil is bad. Um, but for ancient societies, including, right, like Greeks and Romans and indigenous African societies and like indigenous folks in Asia and in parts of Central and South America, like the underworld is there because it exists. It just is, right? There's the underworld. And they rule over death, which isn't always bad, right? Death is death. It's inevitable. It's a part of our kind of life cycle. And so we also have to be careful about applying our context to these kinds of things. So I realize that I'm complicating this issue, and that's because it is complicated and sort of complex. So I just wanted to make sure that we're not kind of translating the world into this text, right? This is a fictional text. This is one person's perspective, um, which doesn't mean it doesn't have reality to it, right? But there's only so much of the complicated, complex, right, realities that we can put in a fictional book meant for young people. So that's another version of the traditional versus modern tension, is this relationship between indigenous cultural and spiritual practices and what we might call Western cultural and spiritual practices, i.e., right, Christianity and modern medicine, etc. But again, there is a tension between those two things. And so that's one level of difference, right? Traditional versus modern, indigenous versus quote unquote Western. And I'm using quotes there again because Western is this word that we use that's not a real sort of scientific or geographic thing, but it's a way of distinguishing. It's a code word, right, for distinguishing between sort of white, which equals modern, versus non-white, let's say, and that often equals the past. And that is the thing that I want to caution us against, that indigenous people anywhere in the world, and that includes in the United States, are somehow a relic of the past. When in fact, right, the cultural practices that have been around for generations and centuries among indigenous people of any place are still alive, are still in practice, are still around. And so it's never a good thing to sort of think about those folks as not a part of modern current society. So that's my one sort of warning context about that. The other mode of difference that we get here is also in class. So we meet in our later, in the middle of the book, Mr. Patel. So Mr. Patel is a wealthy immigrant businessman from India. He is also a person who adopts a very, very traditional way of operating in terms of his family, right? His entire family lives on this compound, this huge compound in Botswana. He believes in sort of arranged marriage for his daughters, and the sort of that all of them should live where he is, and he should know, Basically, he believes he should be in everybody's business. And those are traditional Indian values. And he has this one daughter whose name is Nandira, who is 16, and there's a tension there because she wants to be a sort of modern woman, like Madame Motswe, and he is very adamantly against that. So there's that. But the class differential, I want to kind of, and the cultural tensions that exist in that relationship between Africans and Indians, I want to demonstrate that. Or not demonstrate it, talk about it. So, people from South Asia, mostly India, but also other parts of that region of Asia, right, were brought to, during colonization, um, South Africa and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa as laborers, right? So that created a different class of people. So now you have the colonizer, i.e., European folks. Then you have in South Africa what are called colored folks, and those are people of mixed race, but also people of South Asian descent. And then you have indigenous African people. And I said that in that order because that was a sort of hierarchy that was set up, right? White people on top, South Asian people in the middle, indigenous Africans in the bottom. And that was a system that's set up, right, by colonization. And so oftentimes there were, because South Asian people have still sometimes, or people who would be considered colored, right, have more privileges, social privileges in a lot of ways, and class privileges in some ways, than indigenous Africans, right, there's an obvious tension there. So even though both groups are subject to the kind of violence that is colonization, right, in pitting them against each other in this way prevents a sort of unified, prevents people from seeing that they have common interests. And that's true, in all kinds of places, right? Some people would make the same argument about poor white people and black people or people of color in the United States. So there's this tension there that's created because of class. So there are other ways. Again, I said this video is about difference. There are other ways. One difference is a cultural difference, right? So there's a traditional versus modern. That's one. There is Indian versus African. That's two. And then there's, of course, a class difference because Mr. Patel is extraordinarily wealthy. And so all these indigenous Africans who, of course, are from this particular land have watched him come as an immigrant and sort of become wealthy off of this business he has, which is legitimate, not necessarily exploitative. But it's difficult and he has literally roped himself and his family off from this particular place where he lives, right? From Botswanans by creating this humongous wall. And I think that sort of class difference also matters. And so I just wanted to point this out in this video, which has been a little long, but these things require a lot of explanation, that this is Alexander McCall Smith's way of sort of illustrating that although his book is focused on everyday Botswanans, right? Madame Motswe's father worked in the mines, he invested in cattle, and that's how she was able to open an agency. Mr. J.O.B. Matakoni, regular dude, runs a car repair shop. And all of her clients, up until Mr. Patel, have been everyday people. And so I think these chapters are just sort of moving our cultural lens and our cultural landscape for the book outward. So now we have indigenous Africans doing sort of non-Christian sort of spiritual practices or witch doctors, and the narratives that we tell ourselves about them have created this fear among Botswanans. And then we have Indians, this wealthy Indian family who literally exists in a different world that's right down the street. And so I think we're now fleshing out a little bit of this world of the book to make it even bigger than it was in the first few chapters. And that's important. So that there wasn't a lot of tea in this video, but that is some historical context, if you will, for the book as we go forward. So we will get back to the tea in the next episode. But until then, I will see you all soon.